York ain't New York anymore. How I miss those old pals of mine.
What happens when a legendary historian aims his keen eye in the rearview mirror of his own life, examining the places, people, and experiences that made him a great storyteller? Well, when that author is David Pietrusza, the answer is the rich, funny, and poignant memoir, Too Long Ago, A Childhood Memory, A Vanished World. Hello, history lovers, and welcome. I'm your host, Dean Carianis, and this is the History Author Show on iHeartRadio. And a special welcome to everybody watching via YouTube. On our YouTube channel, you can see us bring this lost world of 1950s and 60s Amsterdam, New York, to life for you in multimedia splendor, thanks to film and photos from David Pietrusza's personal archive. When a friend encouraged David to write his life story, he didn't think it was a good idea. But when he told me about that friend's idea, I thought it was a great one. What better way for everybody to get to know the man I've been fortunate to get to know? The man that's been called one of the greatest political historians of all time, and also the undisputed champion of chronicling presidential campaigns. He's always ready with a clever quip, which is probably due to his heroes, the Marx Brothers, or with a bit of wisdom from the past. David has written or edited a treasure trove of books over the years, and you've seen him on so many TV and radio shows that I can't even begin to list them here. He sat down with me to discuss 4 of his previous books, which you can see here over my shoulder. They are TR's Last War, Theodore Roosevelt, The Great War, and A Journey of Triumph and Tragedy. Rothstein, The Life, Times, and Murder of the Criminal Genius Who Fixed the 1919 World Series. 1920, The Year of the 6 Presidents. And 1932, The Rise of Hitler and FDR, 2 tales of politics, betrayal, and unlikely destiny. You can enjoy those interviews in our archives wherever you're listening now, and you can find our guest at davidpietrusza.com. He's also on Twitter and Facebook. Okay, now that we've handed the keys to the time machine over to a man who really knows his way around the past, let's join David Pietrusza and go to the days of his youth that are too long ago. I'm joined by acclaimed author David Pietrusza. He's here to discuss his most personal book yet, one I've really been looking forward to. It's titled Too Long Ago, A Childhood Memory, A Vanished World. Thank you so much for making the time to chat with me. This is our 5th interview. People can see, if they're watching via YouTube, all your books behind me that I have had the pleasure of reading and talking to you about. And this is our very first Zoom conversation. Usually we meet up in person.
Yeah, we've never done even Zoom on a personal basis. So brave new world.
You open up Too Long Ago with the line, "I was born. Stuff happened before then, so they tell me." And it struck me very much in your voice, and your voice is something that comes through very clearly, even in your non-memoir work, even in your works on history, if you're talking about a Calvin Coolidge, let's say. And when we talked about 1920, the year of the 6 presidents, up at the FDR library, I likened your editorial quips to Alan Hale Jr., the skipper from Gilligan's Island, and the way that he always would break the fourth wall. He would look into the camera and he would just have that look on his face. And can you believe what is going on right now? And I always enjoyed that. And I enjoy it about your writing because I'm getting more than just the voice of Coolidge or here's what happened at this time. And here you decided to tackle a book that's all in your voice. Your voice is front and center. It's your story, not Coolidge's story or Theodore Roosevelt's story. How was writing a memoir different from these books that people can see behind me that talked about people that were long ago that weren't going to call you and complain, but that was your story, things you wanted to say? How was it different?
Frightening. Absolutely frightening. And as you know, I didn't want to do the book. Did not want to do the book at all. And what happened was a friend of mine had been after me for years to do the book. And she said, I don't care what you write about. Okay, it's your voice. I want to hear your voice. And I would tell her over and over again, no, this is the worst idea I have ever heard in my life. No one is going to want to read this. No one, and you know, and it is too personal. You know, it's not writing about some historical figure that, you know, has been dead for a long time. And I really enjoy writing about dead people because they can't sue you. Okay. And but even when I write about the people that are in this book who may be deceased, they still have friends. They still have relatives walking around. Some of those relatives are my relatives, okay? And you're not sure how that's going to go around. And I did face the same issue that I did with the other books is, should I tell this? How far do I go with this? I in that initial package or portion of the book that you read, the first few sentences, a few sentences afterwards, I sort of declaim that I have an alibi for everything that happened beforehand my birth, but that for the things that happened afterwards, I may be guilty of, and I take the Fifth Amendment. So this is not a tell-all book. It's not a tell-all book about me, nor about my antecedents, because there is a commandment that says, honor thy father and thy mother. Okay, there are some things which are not in this book, but it's not unalloyed nostalgia. It's bad things happened, and there's a balance of that in life where, yes, there was a sense of community. There were stronger traditions and an adhesion of family and ethnicity, but there were also terrible things happening to people. It occurred to me the other day in the book, I mentioned a couple of things that happened on J Street, which was the street over from where I was growing up until I was about 10, and then I moved to. And in the book, I mentioned that one of the first shocks of real death was that one of my classmates' father, a barber, died. He was only 60, and he was a close friend of mine, and this hit me kind of hard. And then another classmate's brother just fell playing on the sidewalk. I think he was 10, 12 years old, Bobby Satursky, and they took him to see the doctor. And he came home, and at 9 or 10 o'clock that night, he just died. And they lived across the intersection from each other, basically. And then I thought recently that another classmate's father on that 2-block street died when I was in grade school. Times were tough then. There's all these incidents of people just falling and becoming either, addled or blind or dying. And certainly up until the 1950s, that great fear of every mother in America, polio. And then we got a vaccine and things got a hell of a lot better. So life was rough. There was a Great Depression for these people. There were lousy times in the old country, lousy times in the new country, but they surmounted that thing. They survived.
You talk about things that you don't mention, and it made me think of Theodore Roosevelt's wife, Edith, and how she felt that a woman should only be in the newspaper 3 times. She should be there for her birth, her engagement, and her obituary. And so those are things that in all caps, we do not talk about. And that's part of this vanished world. When I'm going back and I'm reading Too Long Ago, I think today everyone is such an exhibitionist. We have things all about us all over online, on social media, where there are things that you wrote it down. And then even though people were long gone, you said, I just can't tell that because I can hear their voice in my head saying, no, David, don't do that.
Yeah, there's one thing absolutely which I have revealed, not only not revealed in this book, but to other people, which would be very painful and very private and very horrible, which happened my family members. My maternal grandparents, their history was not all wonderful. I'm sure that they would not want some things reported. My grandfather, my mother's father, was quite the alcoholic, was not able to raise his family during the Great Depression. And so my mother was literally farmed out to her uncle, my father's brother, to a dairy farm outside of Amsterdam, New York. Another sister, her sister, was sent to live in Detroit, Michigan, with another uncle. And so, he was not exactly a great success, even though that side of the family did very well and was surprisingly middle class. But that one group of the family tree, which I was descended from, not so good right there. And then because of the stress of her husband's alcoholism, his unemployment, his inability to raise the family, and her son being drafted, wounded at Anzio during the World War II, and also being raped.
Gosh.
She went insane. And so even though she was the only one of my grandparents that I ever knew, because the other three died either before I was born or when I was like 2 or 3 years old, I never really knew her because she was so addled. And not only was she addled, but she was addled in Polish. Okay. Why she was addled in Polish, I don't know, because she was born here. Okay. Wow. But such is the mysteries of the human mind. And so, those things, I don't know if they would have been thrilled that I put them in. Some of the curtain we were pulling back on, and others we are going to leave. And like I say, certainly about myself.
Well, that's what people like to hear. And you do tell some pretty honest stuff here. But it's just interesting that you are that voice for us. And people love that in a memoir. I think of the TV show The Wonder Years, or the book's been compared to A Christmas Story by Gene Shepard. I wanted to mention the cover of Too Long Ago, because that's you as a kid. Look at you. You're beaming from ear to ear. You're holding your uncle's hand. And some might have thought that the cover would be you as a young, strapping baseball player on your way to the major leagues, because that's why I'm wearing a Yankees hat today in honor of all your baseball work. But no, in fact, you're there in a spot that plays such a prominent role in the book. And I think when we look at it, we say, that's an interesting place. We can see the Coke machine behind you and all the things that it promises if we stepped inside. Tell us what pivotal moment you would want people to see when they time traveled back with you into that picture and see young David, meet him.
Well, I was thinking one thing which would intrigue me as to would be, being the presidential historian. And I know some of the early moments which were significant in that, when my Aunt Pearl gave me the pictorial history of the American presidents. And you can see this was not a book that was, just given and never read. This thing was read 1,000,000 times. But what caused me to already be so fanatical that you would give this to an 8-year-old, 7 or 8-year-old kid? Okay, what went beyond that? And I think what was a factor in that was, and I may be not answering your question, but one of the keys to being an interviewee is not to answer questions, but to digress charmingly. Is that culture was not ghettoized so much, okay? So you had things like on the variety shows where you would get all the Broadway shows and production numbers and great songs which were coming out then. You know, this was not like, I mean, can any ordinary person hum a tune from Hamilton? I don't think so. But you knew all the songs from all the shows, and you watched them on like the Ed Sullivan Show, and they were played on the top 40 stations, et cetera, et cetera. So you got that. Even operas and the great tenors would be on shows on prime time broadcasting, not on PBS or YouTube or something you had to go to. And also you had shows like the 20th Century, a documentary that was on every week, or You Are There, which was a recreation of historical events, and Victory at Sea, Project 20, which was on NBC with Alexander Scorby as a narrator. What a voice he had. A Greek.
Thanks.
Alexander Scorby was a Greek. Okay.
Yeah, I picked that up from the name, right? Yeah,
never had much of an acting career. Look him up, and he's like Mr. Obscurity as an actor. But boy, could he narrate. And the editing of these things. I mean, some of the documentaries you see nowadays are like a bit ponderous. But these things, bang, zoom. So how could you not love history? But to kind of understand where I came from, I think you have to go to the church and how crazy religious the Polish people are to this day, really. And so we are just bound up in our Catholicism, and that really helped keep us together during the years of occupation, under the partitions of Poland, the invasions of the Nazis, the subjugation by the Soviets, and here as well. And you know, that the experience, the immigrant experience, you know, I was thinking of making one of these memes or memes or something of you know, like, you don't have to be Jewish. Remember the rye bread ad?
Sure,
you know,
yeah.
like, you know, one of those people in the ad holding up to, you know, or have it in front of them too long ago. You don't have to be Polish to love this book. The experience speaks to a whole bunch of people, you know, strangers in a strange land, and how they make their way.
It makes me think of when I did an event with Eva Stachniak at the Kosciuszko Center in Manhattan, and asked for the first question from the audience, and the fellow said, "Why aren't you speaking Polish?" That's something that plays such a role in your life, as you just mentioned. And you talk about that in the book. You say, for instance, in the Great War, World War I, that Poles made up 4% of the US population, and yet they accounted for 12% of the war dead. So 3 times as many. They were very overrepresented there, to use a modern term. And those conflicts cast such a shadow, and you don't know it, but you're growing up in that shadow. Tell us what that meant for you. What are some of the things that you learned growing up that maybe, I just proved your point there, that you don't have to be Polish to love this book. Somebody like myself who's reading it from a different generation and from a different ethnic background, I say, oh yes, I remember the same thing, or the same kind of thing happening to me growing up, that stamped me with that Greek identity, Greek Orthodox identity, in your case, a Polish Catholic identity.
One of the phrases to describe the Polish identity is Polish Stoicism. And there's a kind of overwhelming feeling that things will go wrong. Okay. Don't take things for granted. I think we're learning that right about now. Things can go very seriously wrong. And when you come from a nation of people that at one time that went very quickly from the largest geographic nation in Europe to disappearing, and then having to survive for 125 or 150 years under foreign domination is just, you know, jarring to you, and then you come over here, and, you know, people are just flummoxed by Polish names, Well, the whole Polish language is like that, and there are very few commonalities, usually derived from Latin, but between the two languages. So how these people came over and learned to speak English it must have been just as vexing for them. And remember how inconsistent English is. I mean, for any immigrant to learn it, I mean, you could just think of all the words which are pronounced, in different ways, and just it's this mind-boggling mix of languages, which is, fails the inconsistency test. It's got to be terrible for a foreigner.
You're just going to work. You're going to come here. You're going to make your place, and you're also going to always cheer for somebody. Like, for instance, I know Banachek, whose name is not spelled very Polishly, by the way, with George Papard, which is one of the...
a Czech.
Yeah, see, you got it. Yeah, I read that about it. But people were proud of it, and it was surprising to me to read that here, that's probably written in the late 60s. It airs in 72, I believe. And many of the stories about it written at the time said how this was a breakthrough for Polish people. Here, he's a smart, driven detective. People make Polish jokes about him, and he always has a ready quip, and he's very cool about it, is George Papard. So all of these things you pick up in the book, and you absorb this sense of Polish pride that you would have had at the time that you grew up with and were really steeped in. And that had to be a really good part for you. That had to be really enjoyable to write down things like that Great War stat and tell people, yeah, we were here. We did our bet. We not only became Americans, but we fought and died for America and to keep our identity, because America let us do that. And someday Poland was going to be back, and we were going to be able to go there and not be strangers in our own ancestral lands.
The thing about the people coming over here is after, they really appreciated America, and they wanted to become Americans. I mean, obviously they held on to their heritage a great deal, but one of the reasons why, and I think almost any ethnic group will tell you this, at least of my generation, is that our parents didn't want you to learn the old language. They didn't want you to be kind of saddled with this. But more personally, and this was told to me straight out, and I heard this from other people as well, they wanted to talk behind our back.
I was thinking the same thing.
they didn't want us to know stuff. So a lot of stuff I don't know. There's a reason why that is.
Pick up just enough. They use Greek the same way, believe me. And then you meet people and they say, well, your Polish isn't very good, or your Greek isn't very good. And growing up, you had to go to school with kids that were from other backgrounds. So it's not as if you can just go around speaking Polish your whole life and stick in that enclave. And for your father, with the place that he would have done that wouldn't have been school, but he works in that factory. They call Amsterdam the rug city. Very few of us anymore work in factories. That is a vanished world. So what did it mean to you growing up in Amsterdam? What did it mean to the town?
Well, you all up and down the East Coast, or I imagine, the rest of the country as well, you have these mill towns. And Amsterdam was founded really because of a creek. It's on the Mohawk River, but it's also more significantly on the Chuktanunga Creek, an old Indian name, and like a 400-foot drop from the top of the city down to the river. And it's a very powerful creek, and people would build mills along it, to power them. And so you'd get the carpet mills, and there were two big companies. Ultimately, by the time came around, there had been a third one, but that merged with Mohawk Carpets. And then there were other things like a broom factory, pearl buttons. They made long underwear. And think about all these industries. Eventually, they got sort of outmoded. People got linoleum. They got carpet tile. They got cheaper carpets. They got carpets from abroad. Okay, tariffs played a part in taking these industries down. Brooms, well, they invented vacuum cleaners. Long underwear, you had central heating and people didn't wear it as much. Pearl buttons, they invented zippers. So we invested our activities in basically all the wrong things. We were not Silicon Valley. I mean, we were at one point, but then the times changed. And this happened all the way up and down upstate New York. Rochester had, IBM and Xerox machines and Kodak and Bang Zoom gone. Binghamton had a lot of shoe factories, and these went offshore. So Amsterdam and upstate New York went, downhill fast. And I say that the rust first appeared on the Rust Belt, I think, in Amsterdam, New York. And what happened is, in January 1955, the larger of the two carpet mills said, "We're out of here. We're out of here." And there was a big strike the year before, which was, I think, the last straw. You also find out that the war had an impact. Wars have these crazy impacts on things. It's not just Rosie the Riveter or the black migration from the south to the north, et cetera, et cetera. There's also little things where in World War II, they stopped carpet production in Amsterdam. They stopped carpet production anywhere because, damn it, we've got a war to win. We're going to make stuff for the Army and the Air Corps, the Navy. And that's what they did in Amsterdam. And so they couldn't even get wool. So when war breaks out in Korea, Bigelow Sanford buys up all this incredibly expensive Australian wool. And then the government doesn't do a damn thing to stop anyone from buying wool. There's no government controls, messing everything up. And they're stuck with all this expensive wool, which means they have to make expensive carpets, which can't compete with people. And so their profits go in the toilet for a couple of years and then into real losses, and which leads to things being terrible, and the carpet mills going out of business, or the first one leaving town in January 1955. My father was thrown out of work. He worked at Bigelow Sanford. And one of my earliest childhood memories, and I really believe my first overnight childhood trip, was to Thompsonville, Connecticut, which was the headquarters of Bigelow Sanford, and where some of the jobs were transferred to, but not his. And we went down there, we stayed into a little motel, and we watched Sergeant Bilko on TV and ate cheeseburgers at some little restaurant. And my father walked up to the gates of Bigelow Sanford to see where his job went. And then we got in the car and drove back home. Not a good beginning to the second half of the so-called prosperous 1950s. But before that time, thousands and thousands of people worked in the carpet mills. And really, it was a prosperous time and a prosperous city. I think even in the Depression, there was a certain degree of stability, even though, carpets were, a luxury. You didn't need to buy a new one if you were out of work or worrying about being out of work. So it was a way of life. And I'll tell you, even after the carpet mills started to move out, and we still had Mohawk carpet mills for a while, we may not have been rich, but damn it, we had the best carpets in the world in our homes. We got quite the discount.
You probably knew who made them. I mean,
we knew personally who made them. And my father was an inspector, so he'd know what the best ones were.
He'd be able to look right at it and tell what was.
I'm not quite sure what went into inspecting carpets, though. I don't know.
We have that picture,
that to me.
Right? We have a picture of
I do.
Right at work.
Yeah.
We'll show that for people watching on YouTube. And we also have some videos from your dad, which is they're so precious. And I think that's another difference from today and this vanished world into long ago is we're just used to it. I mean, kids grow up now with every minute of their life, certainly every significant one, being videotaped. I have a friend and his daughter was maybe 6 and he was telling her a story from the old days, meaning maybe 1994, maybe the 80s. And she said, "Oh, show me the video." And he said, "Well, no, we didn't have a video camera on our phone. We didn't even carry our phone around in those days. We just had to remember things in our brain and then tell people later what happened." So, but they just expect to see this multimedia experience because that's what they've grown up with. And for you, this is so precious. You're able to illustrate your book, and I'm able to therefore do it today with not only pictures, but video. That camera must have been a purchase from before the boom times ended, before the rust started, I would think, because those things weren't cheap back then, not to mention not very light.
Well, no. And the film and getting it developed was, there's very little of it. I think there's all of a half hour that we have, which may be all there was ever shot. And you would shoot just a few seconds of where you were. And so you might not finish that maybe 6-8 minute reel of film to take it into the pharmacy and get it developed for months and months, or maybe a year. It's a really a totally different experience than, well, look, part of the book is to recount things for people who remember them. To say, "Oh yes, I recall that. And we did something very similar. Okay, blah, 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 blah." But also to explain to the younger generation today, or the generations to come, if anyone reads it, what those things were like, and to understand what hardships people had, and to realize how blessed we are right now. At one point I go into some rant about how dirty things were. You never wanted to drive behind a bus. I mean, has that occurred to anyone now? No, it's just, we get stuck in traffic behind a bus and we yell and we shake our fists at it. You're like, "Get out of my way." But there's nothing belching out the back like there used to be. And the air is certainly much cleaner. And one of the things about the carpet mills and the Choctanunga Creek, and where I lived, is the creek came very close to where I lived. And depending on what color they were dyeing the carpets at Mohawk Carpet Mills each day, that would be the color of the Choctanunga Creek: red, orange, purple, yellow, and then that would flow into the Mohawk River, which was, holy cow. Nelson Rockefeller may not have been the most wonderful guy in the world, but he did a lot to clean up that river, because it was grotesque. And interestingly enough, the state of New York had been warning Amsterdam to clean up its sewage, something about like in 1912. People knew this was a problem, and nothing was done until the 1960s. But it has been done. And another thing, mucking up the atmosphere, which I don't think people have to deal with, I hope people don't have to deal with as much today, is smoking. Yeah. People smoked like chimneys back then. And I can, we used to have to paint the interior of the walls of our apartment, our flat, every few years, because they were so coated with nicotine. And I don't think most people would be amazed to hear that today, young people. Maybe if their parents really smoke so much, but I think a lot of them don't. And think of what was going into people's lungs back then. We certainly have health problems now, but I mean, hopefully we're past that great rush of cancer that came from that poisonous substance.
That's definitely something you can go back and say, well, that's interesting. It's a different place. It's just like traveling. That's what history is in a way. Travel to a place you will never be able to go. So speaking of traveling, I want to get back to that. Tell us about this place, because it plays a special part. The place on the cover of your book with young David there, beaming from ear to ear, smiling. What was that place? What did it mean to you growing up in this slice of the world?
That is the back of the bar of A. Lencheski's Bar and Grill, which the fellow who is standing there, someone said, "That's your father, right?" No, wrong. That is my mother's Uncle Tony. And after my mother was farmed out to Herman Marek's dairy farm out in the sticks, she came back to Amsterdam to live with her Aunt Anna and her husband Tony. And they ran this place and opened it up as a actually like a real restaurant. And there was a dance floor on it and booths in the back in the 1930s. Now, by the time I came around in the 50s, the times were a changing even then, and the place was kind of running down. But as you can see, people have commented about my unusual formality in dress, and I think you might see here where that comes from. That Tony was, was not your average looking ethnic bartender back then, and that was his normal attire. He would always dress up, so he gave you a certain standard to go by. And you'd get the denizens of this place going in. So you learn from them about the old days, the oral history of what they went through, and you learn to respect your elders. Okay, don't offend the customers, but also they were great to me. They were like a sort of extended family. Not that I did not have an extended family back then, but you'd have the retired fireman who would come in. You would have the most interesting guy was a fellow named Cousin George Casabone. And what Casabone the most interesting thing he would do was he would come in from the countryside, and he was a real banty rooster of a guy. And he would come in and play the fiddle, in the bar room. And I don't know how many bar rooms he came in and did this, but he certainly did this with ours. And he would douse for water. He'd get this stick out, and he would it would go down. He could find where water was underground, and he could predict the weather. And he would be written up in not just the local papers, but the regional papers. And one day one summer, we had a massive drought, and he went in and said, Monday it's going to break. You're going to get a big downpour. And I was downtown in the library hanging out because, well, there were books there. There were books there. And because, again, there was no air conditioning, boys and girls. So in the middle of a drought, or even in the middle of the summer, you wanted someplace that was cool, which the library was. So I'm coming back from walking home from that library that day, and lo and behold, the skies open. And going back up to my home, I felt going up one of the many, many hills of Amsterdam. I was like a salmon going upstream. There was so much water coming down at me. So Cousin George Casabone was quite the character, even though he wasn't my cousin.
You're enjoying my conversation with David Pietrusza about his memoir, Too Long Ago, A Childhood Memory of Vanished World. Follow him at dpietrusza on Twitter, or find him at davidpietrusza.com. Book Life writes, quote, "Pietrusza's storytelling skills carry the day. Anyone who has ever thought longingly about days gone by in picture-perfect small towns will devour these enjoyable reminiscences. They call Too Long Ago a strikingly nostalgic look at the up and down fortunes of an evolving town in the 20th century, sure to entice those who long for the good old days." Now, I wanted to mention that, of course, this is not just the good old days. This is not a book just for people who grew up in the Eisenhower years, let's say, or people who are familiar with this corner of Amsterdam, this corner of New York State. Upstate New York tends to get overlooked then as now. It's a book really for everybody. So I think, I mean, I enjoy it. I enjoy spending time with you, and I would encourage people to do so if they can. But if you can't, picking up this book is the next best thing. So make your pitch to those people, even if they're not from upstate New York anywhere. I know those people will like the book. So what about other people? What are they telling you? What are you hearing from them where they say things maybe like I did? And I say, oh, hey, I identified with this book, even though I'm not from there or from then.
Well, I have heard from people who are not from Amsterdam, or even specifically my neighborhood, and said yes, you know, maybe the person was Italian or from Queens. It's like, yeah, this is what life was like. And I think also, without being too immodest, the you know, the way it's told. You know, the story is in the telling. And so some of the material, it's like, I was wondering, is, well, you know, this material's a bit thin. You know, is this going to carry the day with the average reader? And it really is, with the asides or the insights to make the day. And also that it is that mix of the good times, or the nostalgic times, or the horrible times, the tragic times, not just economically, but in terms of people's deaths, or in many cases, you know, multiple deaths. And so you don't play all the notes on the piano at the same time to make the tune or the symphony. And you don't play the same notes in the book or the memoir to like, oh yes, everything was great. And the 324 pages, you know, or everything was terrible. And, you know, you just say, oh, this is a bummer, you know, man, you know. So you try to create that flow. I like to say about my prose, what I'm working at is to make it sing, to make the words on the page sing. And I hope I've done that here.
Speaking of singing and music, therefore, your father was a drummer. We have some photos that you sent me of your dad drumming. And it occurred to me, I never asked you if you had any musical talent. Did you ever try to pursue it? What did having a father who was a drummer mean to you?
Well, he did it part-time. There were so many events back then, so many weddings and bars and clubs that had live music. People went out more. And so there were a lot of venues where he could play from the time he was a teenager until the 1950s, when, you know, the tastes were changing. He played, some people say, well, I could play both kinds of music, country and Western, you know. Well, he could play three kinds. He could play polkas, obereks, and mazureks. Okay. But once the fashions came in, and you see this with a lot of the 1940s movies, a real fascination with that kind of Cuban Latin beat, you know. And when that got popular, he just didn't care for it. It just couldn't play it. I don't think he really disliked listening to it, but polkas were in his blood. And also, I think, you get a little older, you got the day job in the carpet mill, as long as that lasted. And so, you know, dragging yourself into work at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning after you've been setting things up was, or taking things down in the Polish National Alliance Hall or St. John's Hall or the Dewdrop Inn, tough going. One of the things he did complain about was, you know, carrying these drums around is a pain. He's so admired or so envied, the clarinet player. You just take that thing under your arm and you go
Yeah.
home. But in terms of my musical abilities, like none. Now, he never pushed it on me. Never pushed it on me. Never pushed anything really on me, whether sports or, you know, anything. I was sort of left to my own devices and prejudices and my own interests, which looking back at it, I find very remarkable. Or maybe I was just too stubborn to do anything I wasn't interested in. I don't know. But one of the things was when he got drafted into the Army in World War II. At one point, you know, he volunteered or got. I must have volunteered to go into a military band. And then at the last minute, he decided not to, and he got out of it. And that band was sent into the South Pacific, and the plane crashed, and everyone on it was killed. So, you know, things can, you know, it's like, what if you were at that intersection just a few minutes earlier? You could have been, that tractor trailer could have got you. Life is so fragile. And then where would I be? I ask you, where would I be? Sure. Where would this interview be? Yeah. So no, I would play around with the drums in the living room and a beautiful pearl set. I don't know what happened to those. They were in his attic before he died. And then somehow they were not there. And then there would be strange little things around the house, like an ocarina. Do you remember the ocarinas?
Wow.
Not the Macarena, but there was an instrument called it was called a sweet potato. And we had one of those. It was made out of like Bakelite, the stuff that old telephones were made out of. Remember those? Man, wow. you could hit them with a hammer and they wouldn't break.
Yeah, it's ruined movies now, because you used to be able to really slam those things down, or every now and then there'd be a Humphrey Bogart, someone would hit someone with a phone. Now, I mean, I have my phone here. I mean, I can't slam this down, and it's not very satisfying at all. I could hit someone with it, but I don't think it'll do. It's not the same, you know. Going like this after an angry call with Mr. Spacely is not.
Here's another fun fact, which I was startled to learn. Amsterdam didn't get direct dial until 1954.
Yeah,
party up until that point, you know, you were still going through the operator. Not to mention all the party lines people had, which talk about stories that people didn't want shared. If somebody was listening in, they got shared.
Yeah, everyone can hear your call if they pick up that extension. And I can think of all your neighbors being in your house. Maybe, I don't even know if young people today can really relate to a scenario, but think about if you had to share maybe your email address with all your neighbors. Maybe that's the closest thing we have today. And I do like that in Too Long Ago, you stop and explain those things, and in such a way that people don't feel like myself, who knows what a party line is. I don't feel like, oh, why is he telling me this? It's always interesting. That's part of that making the words sing. And maybe that's one of the reasons why people were so much closer back then as a community, because you'd have to know your neighbors, because you might pick up the phone and they were getting some awful news or giving some awful news.
Well, they'd also help you out. When things went bad and the carpet mills moved out and my parents were unemployed, you know, how do you pay the rent? Well, it was because we lived with relatives, and you know, that went on the pad for a while. You know, our credit was good. Our credit with the grocer, the Saturskis up the street, was good. You know, and that was one of those stores where they would write the prices with a pencil on a paper bag, you know, and so they would trust you as well. You depended on these people for help more than you would today. Now you don't even know your neighbors. You don't know who they are. You don't know who their names are. And back then, well, one of the things about the immigrant experience, and I'm sure with any immigrant group to this day, is that one guy comes over from the old country And then before you know it, his brother comes over, and then he brings his mother and father and his sister over. And he brings over his cousins, who, as Gilbert and Sullivan wrote, whom he numbers by the dozens. And before you know it, there's this group of people, whether it's Colombians in Queens nowadays, or Vietnamese in Minnesota, or Poles in Amsterdam, who largely came from, two little villages in southern Austria. That's, by the way, they're or southern Poland. They're all pretty much from the Austrian Habsburg ruled Poland in Amsterdam. There are some, but mostly from those two villages. And in Amsterdam as well, the Italians, they come from two separate villages, one from the north of Naples, one from the south of Naples. And not only, and they come and they settle in either the West End, if they're from the one village, or the South side from the other. So you can sort, and they're related. They're related, and they know each other from the old country, which is one reason why they are so close knit for a generation or two in the new country. So when I'm a kid, I'm always going to wakes, because, well, my parents may have worked with some family member of the deceased in the mills, or you knew them from up the street, or with great frequency, you were related. You were shirt-tailed relatives or in-laws of hundreds and hundreds of people back then. But on my street here, I don't know. They're certainly not my relatives.
When you first decided to work on this book that became Too Long Ago, well, you didn't really decide. You got pushed and encouraged.
I got beat up. Yeah.
I didn't want to use the word mad.
I resisted.
Yeah. But you had a realization, and that was the stories die with you. We'd want to know the story, for instance, of a picture you sent me. You as a young man when you were writing baseball with Jackie Robinson. If that picture just gets found on the side of a road, we don't know the story of it. Or if it gets found in somebody's attic, then people don't know who those people are. And you say, I wonder what that story was. Whose wedding was this? Who are these people? What was the most rewarding thing about writing this to you? Maybe something that, even after all your publishing experience, surprised you at the end and surprised you in what you're hearing from people who read it.
Boy, I was amazed. I'm still amazed by the reaction I'm getting, that so many people were able to relate to, you're putting stuff in, and you're talking about this one little lunch counter that meant something to you. And then you find out that, that reference speaks to so many people. And it speaks. I put it in also because of the stability of pricing, which went on back then, right? And I use that to illustrate that. But it also it really, I think, brightened a lot of people's days who recalled that. But I know at least one person who has started to write their memoirs because of this book. And he was involved in the recording industry and knew a lot of, people you would know, recording artists, and worked at, I think, the Village Voice. Which on the face of it sounds a lot more interesting than, what I did. And so, but he hadn't started to do it. And the thing about the decision to write the book, and my excuses not to do it would be the same excuse as everyone else. Well, who wants to hear this? Well, at some point the stories do die. So 2 Januaries ago, when my friend made her last attempt to convince me, and I just said, no, I'm not going to do it. Within weeks of that, a very, very close friend of mine was hit by a massive stroke and then died about a week later without recovering consciousness. And we were partners in crime in a lot of stuff politically, and shared so many of the cultural references that the music, the the shows, the movies, all of that stuff. And I was just thinking, how many stories that he would have had to tell are now lost. And so I said, the stories die with you. The stories will die with me unless I write them down. So I thought that I'd be able to do maybe 20,000 words, and that would get my friend off my living friend off my back, and just maybe publish this little thing and take it as far as going off to college. And within 3 months, I had 70,000 words. Now, some of those words got taken out eventually, and then I played with it and figured out how to publish it and all this, and eventually it came out to about 80,000 words. Now, part of that was my own recollections, and then other parts were stuff I found poking through newspaper archives online, some books I ordered, et cetera, talking to other people, talking to a handful of other people, fleshing things out, adding new stories. But you can do this at home, folks, and have fun with it. Have fun with it, because it can be fun. And how many, I think we all regret not asking our relatives more stuff, and not asking our elders more stuff, like, who is in that picture? How did you two meet? I don't know. My parents always seemed to know each other, but how it all came about, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I guess they were in grade school together for a while. But who knows? I mean, there are a lot of things which are just complete mysteries to me, and I'll never know. So it's the same way with every family, and I guess you owe it to your descendants or to your community to try to preserve these things. One a TV series I worked on, providing interviews, commentary for, was, I think, called Baseball's Golden Age. It was narrated by Alec Baldwin. Why, yes, I have worked with Alec Baldwin. Not really, but on the same project. And what they did was they took people's home movies of old baseball games. And the fascinating thing about that series, I recommend people go to it if they're baseball fans, is you see the same sort of films from baseball history over and over again. And there are things which are not recorded by the professional newsreel and network guys. It's the straight on action. But do you really know what the background of Braves field looked like, or the people walking around? Do you know what the concession stand looked like at Shea Stadium now? No, because it's like, oh, it's not important. Okay. But these people taking home movies would film all this junk and preserve it. Okay. And so this is the stuff which would ordinarily be lost. So fill in those little details which were too little for the big guys to look at and write about. Oh, Edith Roosevelt. Okay, and saying that a woman should only be in the papers 3 times, etc. One of the fascinating things about at least the small town newspaper in my small town was that, were you looking for Edith?
I am indeed.
Yes.
Switched off so people wouldn't know. I'm sorry to.
That's okay.
I switched that off so people wouldn't see me doing it. But yep, see, this is where I got the reference. So
that's a good book. That's a good book, and I think it's better than the other Morris books on the Roosevelts. Really?
Yeah, this is his wife, right?
That's his wife. That's a terrific book.
I agree, it is better.
And so, with Edith says there only should be 3 things in the paper about a woman. Well, in these small town papers, there are all these crazy details. We we were not exactly high society. But if there was a party held in somebody's home for somebody's name day, I'm not talking about birthday, I'm talking about name day.
Yeah, we have those too.
Right.
It's more than your birthday.
If you were named Stephen, you celebrated St. Stephen's Day. Okay, I got gypped because I was named after David, and there's no St. David's Day as far as I know. Okay, but they would name all the people attending this little party or a sorority party above A. Lanchesky's Bar and Grill when my mother was living there. In high school, who the pallbearers were, who the out-of-town people were who came for the funeral, when someone, now because of HIPAA, who checked into a hospital. Okay. All of those things were preserved in these little hometown papers, which is a treasure trove of detail for me. Some of the stuff I didn't want to find out about, but I did. And some of that stuff I passed on.
So many of those things are in here. For instance, your mother, there's a photo of your mother in a wedding dress that is something. I also discovered that there is Benedict Arnold there, buried there. He's not the Benedict Arnold you're thinking of, but you have your own Benedict Arnold, and not just a guy sharing that name, but an interesting story and an interesting and accomplished fellow in his own right. Plus, people will be able to learn who or what Gomozo is. Sounds like someone Godzilla would fight, but it is not. I can tell you that much. But there are so many memorable stories and characters in Too Long Ago. There are lessons. For instance, always carry a guitar when you're driving in a car with somebody in case you get pulled over, which doesn't sound like it makes any sense. But once people hear the story in your book, it makes, well, not that much more sense, actually. It's still a very strange story, but it's your story, and we can enjoy it here in Too Long Ago. I wanted to close with asking, say you are tempting time travelers. They're on their way back to 1932 Berlin to kill Hitler. And you say, hey, why don't you stop on your way and say 1957 Amsterdam and stop there and check out the town? Who would you tell those time travelers they absolutely have to meet? Where would you tell them that they absolutely have to go to experience this vanished world?
A bookie joint. We haven't talked about gambling in Amsterdam and how absolutely pervasive it was among the working class. And it basically got put out of business by state-run lotteries.
New York Lotto. All you need is $1 and a dream.
The government moves in and shoves people aside. Don't mess with our racket now. Before we said this was immoral and terrible, yeah. The tax on the poor and ruined your character. But now it's for education. Yeah. It's for the children.
Yeah.
Okay. These things are all connected. But in gambling, the money back then did not go for education. It went. It
might if you didn't pay up.
Well, most of it was pretty small scale and penny ante. I mean, they would have some games in the back room, which I heard, a bunch of money was changed hands, but they kind of made it up in volume with literally nickel and dime and quarter bets, at least with my family. So you'd bet a quarter on a straight hit. And maybe people don't understand how the numbers worked. Okay. Another thing you have to explain to a younger generation.
And the pegboard.
The pegboard. Yeah, the pegboard. You'd have this little thing and you'd have all these little pieces of paper and a board and you'd pull one out and maybe you'd win something. But the numbers, it was based on what the payoffs would be at a given track in given races. And it's a three-digit number. What that number was, the odds, of course, would be 991, 99 to 1, and they only pay off at about 500 or 600 to 1. So you'd bet straight if that number came in, and you'd get the 500 or whatever. And then a box hit would be if those three numbers came in any sequence, and you'd hedge your bets and bet a dime on that. And of course, growing up in Amsterdam, we're very near to Saratoga. So the big social events of the year sort of would be to get in the car and get to Saratoga in a mad race to lose your money, really.
That's Benedict Arnold, maybe. I mentioned your local Benedict Arnold. That was his big battle, not your Benedict Arnold, but the Benedict Arnold. That was his big win in the revolution. So
my parents would always take me to historic sites. Part of my historic education was, living in upstate New York and having parents who would pack me in the car on a Sunday or a Saturday and take me at my request to all of these things, like the Saratoga battlefield. Three umpires. Here's the baseball reference. Three empires come together where I come from, upstate: the Dutch, the British, and the French. And a lot of massacres going on between those empires, but you can learn a lot, and then you go down river to Hyde Park or to Grant's Cottage, where U.S. Grant died in Wilton, outside of Saratoga. So all of those things, but the gambling was I would as I would say, run numbers, not for a bookie, but for my parents, and they would send me off to one of these little joints, a grocery store. Usually they would be in things called a confectionery. If you saw the word confectionery, with these shelves, which were all empty, and people going in all day and not buying anything, well, you didn't have to be Columbo to figure out what the hell was going on there.
Or Banachek.
No, right.
You would have been Banachek.
But the gambling was the big thing. One of the, in terms of the guitar story, even though there were an unusual number of bars and liquor licenses in the town, and a huge amount of drinking, one of the great sociologists of our time studied Amsterdam and crime there, James Q. Wilson. Now we're going to some real history now. James Q. Wilson developed the broken window theory, which Giuliani used to fix New York City. Hey, remember when New York City was fixed and not broken like it is now? Okay, times change. Well, Amsterdam used the other theory, which was not to arrest anyone. So, you have all these people wandering around drunk all the time, and they would never, ever arrest anyone. So I guess whatever works, but not arresting people in New York City does not work.
Part of that was because of the church. St. Stanislaus, right? This is where you would have grown up and where you spent or did grow up and spent so much of your time. And that is part of that Polish experience that you have in your life. And it's a central part. It's still there, which is nice to see, because a lot of this world is vanished that you grew up in. Yeah,
it was the Poles were such a large group, and context. The city was 30,000 people at its peak, so it's not huge, but it's not tiny, or wasn't tiny then. And so Poles were the largest ethnic group, and built 2 Roman Catholic churches, built a Polish National Catholic Church. And then the town itself was at that point 75% Catholic. And so, kind of a not maybe a unique place, but not Dubuque or anything like that. And there were parochial schools. The school I went to until 8th grade. I've posted some pictures online recently on Facebook of the kindergarten class. There were like 50 some kids in that class. And people say, that was one class in one room? Yeah. You wonder, you second guessers out there wonder why the nuns had to rule with such an iron hand. You try it. You try ruling 50 kids in one class, and then by the time we graduated in 8th grade, there were still 30 some, maybe 40 kids graduating. So you had to maintain order, and you did. And they taught every subject, did it well. That class produced not only myself, okay, it produced the United States congressman, okay, and we did it without any big infrastructure. We didn't have a gym. We didn't have this. We didn't have that. We had blackboards. We had chalk. That was about it. We had a small library upstairs and a nurse's station. And probably because the government said, you had to be accredited. But it was very basic, but you learned stuff, and you took it very, very seriously. There wasn't a lot of loitering around, not at all. But you learned, and people like going back to one of my favorite topics. You think about Calvin Coolidge learning about stuff in Vermont in a far more primitive atmosphere. And, kids back then were learning Greek and Latin and the classics. So even in the 1950s, we were backsliding. We were going downhill. And we weren't learning Polish either. We were learning a few prayers, some Christmas carols, but that's about it. But before I came around, my Aunt Jeannie, who was still alive, who was only 13 years older than myself, was telling me she had to make her confessions in Polish. It's like, so how do you do that? You like come up to someone and say, what's the Polish word for this sin? Asking for a friend,
I can't imagine that. That's tough.
Right.
Yeah. Well, the commandments, maybe you could just write the numbers down. That would have been.
That's right. Commandment jeden.
Well, David Pietrusza, thank you so much for joining me today to discuss Too Long Ago. I really enjoyed the book. I always enjoy your company. And I'm glad that now readers can just pick up this book and they can experience what it's like to sit with you and talk. If you're out of things to watch on TV, you're tired of scrolling through your phones, pick up Too Long Ago, enjoy this book. I really like the idea of being able to go back there and meet young David. He looks like a really happy kid. And so I want to thank you so much for sharing him with me. And I want you to also thank your friend for pushing you into writing this memoir, because I'm sure people are going to read it, enjoy it, and Amsterdam thanks you.
Thank you.
Again, the book is titled Too Long Ago, A Childhood Memory, A Vanished World. Find the Amazon link to purchase your copy at thehistoryauthor.com page for this episode. By buying a book through us, you help keep the flux capacitor on our time machine humming like usual. My thanks to David Pietrusza for yet another entertaining conversation about yet another great book. He's such a fun guy to spend time with, and if I could introduce each of you to him personally, I would definitely do that. For now, his video and photographs and our interview, not to mention his book, are the next best thing. If you're a YouTube subscriber, I hope you enjoyed watching this interview today and seeing all those nuggets of the past. Remember to enjoy my conversations with David Pietrusza about his previous books. Those are T.R.'s Last War, Theodore Roosevelt, The Great War, and A Journey of Triumph and Tragedy. Rothstein, The Life, Times, and Murder of the Criminal Genius who fixed the 1919 World Series. 1920, the year of the 6 presidents. And 1932, the rise of Hitler and FDR. 2 tales of politics, betrayal, and unlikely destiny. Visit our guest at davidpietrusza.com. You can also find him on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. You can find me at History Dean on Twitter, and I'm also on Facebook and LinkedIn, as well as Instagram. That's it for this installment of the History Author Show. I hope you'll join us for our next all-new interview right here on iHeartRadio. Until our next trip into the past together, thanks so much for time traveling with us today, and have a great week.
We still call it Broadway, but what's in a name? Take it from Georgie, it isn't the same. On the east side, west side, things ain't like before. There are tears in the eyes of the regular guys. Oh, New York ain't New York anymore.